stuff happened before I cut the video. So let's get to our first little topic. And what I want to talk about is grinding and that line when it comes to game design. And of course, the game that I've been playing that kind of inspired this is Graveyard Keeper. Now, Graveyard Keeper comes from Lazy Bear Games, and they're the developers behind Punch Club, which is a game, again, that really focuses on a very short core gameplay loop that they pad out with a lot of grinding. In that game, thank you. But in that game and in Graveyard Keeper, both are designed around you unlocking new things to do via your skills. You perform tasks, you get experience points, you put them in, you unlock something new. But they both have a very, very long-term progression of you do a task to get the item so you can go do another task, so then that person wants something else, so you go do that, and you rinse and repeat until you either beat the game or you succumb to madness. So in Graveyard Keeper right now, and you guys haven't seen this yet because I've been playing it off play, and I don't think we could play this game on stream for like the entire length. I think everyone will fall asleep. But right now I just unlocked all the shortcuts in the church that lets me basically move in and around. So to move forward, I need to process this for a second so I can get the exact chain of events. Okay, so in order to upgrade my church to get more money, I need to fish and to get salmon fillets. So I need to cut the salmon fillets up to give it to the cardinal or the bishop. So once I upgrade the church, then I can go build better stuff. But to do that, I need to gather iron ore. But to get the iron ore, I need to go up into the mountains. And then I need to make sure I have a higher quality pickaxe. But to get a better pickaxe, I need to upgrade my metalworking so I can build steel-related tools. But to get the steel-related tools, I need to do more research to get spirit experience. But the only way to get spirit experience is I need to get faith. But to get the faith, I need to go to the church. Hold on. I need to run the ministries. I need to run the various prayers to get the faith. But to get better faith, I need to upgrade my sermons. But to get more sermons, I need paper. And in order to get the paper, I need to get ink. And then I need to get the ink, I need to get the I need to build the press, the printing press. But to build the printing press, I need more upgrades. But to get more red and green, I also need to do more iron and mining, and also do more farming. And I need to take a drink after that whole discussion right there. Oh, and for those of you who've been watching, I did finally get the stamp, so now I can take the meat that I cut from people and sell it to get more money. And I can use that money to buy more stuff. But yeah, this is pretty much Graveyard Keeper's core gameplay loop in a nutshell. It's doing stuff to unlock more stuff that you're required to do to get even more stuff. And there's old progress bars and a fancy old tech tree that I'm slowly but surely climbing up in order to do all this. Now, as I just said in that very long discussion, there is a lot to do. But it really pushes what we consider to be fair and unacceptable levels of grind. Now, for those of you who didn't watch my previous video or post about it, I consider grinding is when the player is forced to repeat tasks. Yeah, and I'll get to that in a second. When the player is forced to repeat tasks in order to make a very small amount of progress, while everything else that they have access to is not going to move them forward. So a famous example of this is the MMO grind, where you run out of quests at your level, so you cannot do any low-level quests. So your only option to move forward and unlock more stuff is to just fight nameless enemies for 5 to 10 hours. And when a game becomes a grind, that's when things start to really slow down, and when it becomes almost painful to keep playing the game. And when that occurs, it can push a lot of people away. But for some people, they find that kind of grinding, maybe something like Punch Club and Graveyard Keeper, to be acceptable. And that's what I want to discuss for our little topic here. Why is it fair or not as bad in Graveyard Keeper, and even get something like Punch Club, but when grinding occurs in RPGs, or even when you look at them in roguelike games where you have to keep grinding the persistence system in order to get better, is not as favorable? And I think it has to do with the fact that in a game like Graveyard Keeper, the developers do a really good job of giving that carrot on the stick, as Foreign said in chat. You have the tech tree that always shows what you have access to and what's coming down the line. So mining leads to ironworks, ironworks lead to better tools lead to steel production, and then steel production leads to steel tools, and then we repeat the process. And the various story areas, or the objectives, the game always gives you an idea of what you have to do, and then it's just a matter of going after it. So I'm always pretty much given an idea as to what I want to do next. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take me to do it. We were talking about this on stream the other night about Factorio, and Factorio is another really good example of that. You have the various researches and that very elaborate tech tree, and you're free to go up it or go down the different paths as you see fit. But you're always given an idea that here's where I am, here's what I need to do, and this is where I want to end up. And as long, I think, as the player has a very clear idea of their short-term goals, it's going to lead to that better progress, or lead to the game not feeling too much like a grind. But when you have no idea when you're going to be able to move on, whether it's how many hours it takes to grind out a level, or just repeating the same thing over and over again, then I think it starts to get very painful. And for people watching this live or recorded, can you think of really good examples of when grinding just completely takes you out of the experience? Like for me, when you start, when you cross that line from knowing when you're going to move forward to when it becomes a grind, I always go back to Diablo 3. And Diablo 3 has a very different feel to it when we compare the early and mid game to the end game. I'm talking level 70, Torment 4 and above kind of play. Once you get to that level, you find that a lot of the progress in the game just slows down or disappears entirely. You're no longer leveling up, which means no new skills or rune items to put into or skill gems. So your only options for progressing are either to upgrade your gems, go into the greater rifts, or try and farm for the resources you need to gamble and hopefully get an ancient set, or go more with the Kadai's Cube option. But that leaves so much time spent playing the game that it's completely up in the air in terms of if you're actually going to get meaningful progress. It's a difference from the early and mid game where you're always growing in terms of power. Every level unlocks either a new rune or a new skill, or you're going to get some kind of new gear that gets tied to your loot table. But once you hit 70, all that disappears. And it's very interesting how much Blizzard has adjusted Diablo 3 from retail to 1.0 and then to Reaper of Souls and beyond. Because the original game, it had a much slower progression curve. You had to beat the game on normal, then you beat it on hard, then you go to hell. Not figuratively, of course. But the problem, though, of course, was when you got to the end game, the loot table was too wide. So you could kill an enemy and get something so much more powerful than what you were using, or you kill the enemy and you're not getting anything. So they've tightened up that loot table so you're still making progress as you go up Torment 1 to 10. Or I'm sorry, I think it's up to 14 now. Allergies are killing me. And it looks like it's about to rain again out there too. Perfect. But once you get to level 70, there's just too little progression and not meaningful. I've said this before, but abstract progression, the advantage is that as long as you have numbers, it never ends. But, excuse me, but the problem is that it's not meaningful progression. If I hit an enemy for 10 million points of damage or 10 billion, what's really changing in terms of what I'm doing? Nothing. I need to blow my nose for 1 second. Man. Summertime and rain. It's not a good combination. But the point is, I'm not really seeing anything new. Now, as an interesting point about grind, sorry about rubbing my nose. Unfortunately, it's allergy season. But another interesting point about that kind of grinding and progression, when we played Dead Rising on stream earlier in the summer, as you level up, more elements are added into the abstraction. Frank gets more health, he does more damage, he runs faster. And that stuff does change how you play. Now, one of the things that the game does well, oh man, one of the things that the game does well is the fact that everything that Frank does gets him experience. As long as I'm killing enemies, finding survivors, beating the psychos, the experience is very generic in that regard. So even if I'm just going very slowly, I'm eventually going to reach those points. I'm going to try not to. Yeah. And Warframe is another interesting one. It does go for a stupidly long-term progression. You have the various gears. In order to get them, you have to either craft them or buy them. You have the various solar system campaign. But you're always doing something that in some way, shape, or form is moving you forward. Whether you're moving forward by centimeters, inches, or miles, you're always having that sense that I'm getting better. I'm going from here to maybe here, or maybe I go up to here. But as long as the player feels like there's momentum, the grinding is not as bad. Now, here's a question for you, and you brought up Path of Exile. And that is one that, again, I think I have to agree that that progression model is, or I'm sorry, you were talking about the rings, but in Path of Exile, that massive skill tree, it's very interesting. And for those of you who haven't watched our previous talks on it, the Path of Exile skill trees is a massive multi-screen sprawl. You have tons and tons of incremental upgrades, plus 5 attack, plus 2% life drain. Bows do 2% more damage. And then as you go around the skill tree, there are massive nodes that change things. You may have a node that says, from now on, your blunt damage will cause stun. Or, from now on, magic will draw from your health instead of from mana. And then you have these then there's even special ones that go further that are build affecting. From this point forward, all attacks will never stun an enemy, but you'll gain increased attack speed for each consecutive hit. And what they do is that it's very much similar to a idle game. Interestingly enough, I've been playing Clicker Heroes 2 on and off, and it also features that Path of Exile style, like 5 screens worth of nodes to go around, and you're again free to pick and choose what you're going to do. But so much of it is incremental that you really have to keep your eye on the prize in terms of, okay, I want to get to this node over here. So it's going to take me at least 8 to 9 levels as I'm going to slowly work my way across. And I know there are people who have played Path of Exile, and they have mapped out their skill tree or their progression, with a spreadsheet. They know exactly, okay, at level 5 I should be here. At level 8 I want to go over here. And by the time I hit level 40, I will be, I'll have my build all raring to go. I never got the Ascendancy bonuses. I need to go back to Path of Exile at some point and try that out. But And that's different from a game like Warframe, where while you are leveling up, you're improving your I forget your legendary rank or your ranking or your mastery rank. There we go. You're a lot that the upgrades are directly added to your character. When you get a new weapon, of course, that's a new thing you're going to be able to use. When you get a pet or that thing that flies behind you and stuff like that. So the upgrades that you get, you can see immediately and apparent, or they're very apparent in terms of what they're going to do to enhance your abilities. But in a game like Diablo or an MMO, getting a new sword or getting a new level doesn't really change. I think you're right, Sentinels. And when you're not able to see clearly what you're doing, when you're not able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, is when it becomes very frustrating. Nice. To keep playing, because there's no idea as to when you're going to move forward or when you're going to get something new. And it is an art in terms of pacing to keep that carrot on the stick engaging to the player. With something like Clicker Heroes 2, they still, I think, have to balance out, getting those unlocks, getting something new that, is going to change the screen or make things more interesting. A really interesting example would be, oh no, what was the name of that? One second, I need to look this up. Here it is. Here's a game, I'm curious if anyone else has played this, but it's Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms. What this is it's an idle game built on the Dungeons and Dragons background. And what they do is they have multiple events and specific things that, and I'll get your point in a second for because that's a good one, that you unlock new characters, there's treasure that you can add to your people, they have seasonal or even monthly events that will unlock new characters that you can then add to your party. And it's a very min-max affair in that regard, as you're able to figure out, okay, how do I want to arrange my formation, what characters do I use to try and push as far as I can. And it does a really good job of that, the next thing to do, the next thing, and so on. But it's still a clicker game. And as Foreign said, it's pretty much Pavlovian, there we go, in terms of its design. And I've said this before, but any idle game, it's just a progression model without any kind of gameplay attached to it. And as we've said before, a really good progression curve or progression system can do so much to keep a player going. In Dead Cells, for instance, the whole idea of spending cells to unlock new concepts, that is pretty much a progression model in a nutshell. But as long as the player feels like they are growing, it will keep them motivated to play. The second that it feels like there's no more progression is when things just go downhill from there. And I think one of the bad things, and one of the things you have to be aware of when you have these progression curves, is when it feels like you're just putting in fun pain. And we talked about that before with Ramin, who I should really get in touch with again to get him back on. But there's that very fine line between a game being a grind, but the player is motivated to keep going, and the game is a grind, and it feels like the developers are just exploiting you to keep playing. Because we have seen our fair share of free-to-play and mobile games that it's just, oh, you can spend the next 20 to 30 hours, and then you'll maybe get an upgrade, or just give us $5.99, we'll give it to you right now. And that's another really good point. Mobile and free-to-play games are geniuses at getting players hooked in the early game. We've talked about this before with gacha systems and loot boxes, where they are precisionally built to keep the player or get them hooked when you first play. And I talked about this with Ramin, but if you always play, if you've played enough free-to-play and gacha-based games, they all have a very blueprint early game. You start the game, you will get, a basic quest, you'll complete that. The game will introduce you to premium currency as a way of speeding things up. But of course, the first few hits are free. You will get a basic loot box or gacha, and you'll probably get something that's predetermined. And then what they'll do as, the sinker or the hook is that they'll give you a one-time roll of either the highest gacha or maybe a 3 or 4 star gacha. And that will get you a rare character or a rare item. And then that puts that thought in your head as to, oh my god, that's so amazing, I need to keep playing because maybe I'll get something better. And then the hook begins. And as we've talked about, that progression is inherently built to slow down the further you play. The more characters you unlock, the less value you get at rolling the loot boxes or the gachas, unless you spend the money or the premium currency to try a higher quality one, push your luck. And as you play, it becomes harder and harder to get that same endorphin push. I think that's the right neurotransmitter of, that pleasure of I get something new. So you have to keep playing, you have to keep spending money. And again, these games are tilted against the player. Dopamine, thank you. And what happens is when you get to the end game, or I should say the late game, because there really is no end game in a gacha or loot-based system, that it becomes less likely that you're going to get any meaningful upgrades. When I played, I forget the name of the free-to-play game I played when I first got my smartphone. But what happened was, in order to make progress in the story, I needed 5 and 6 star heroes. But the basic loot box or the basic gacha only rolls 1 and 3. So I had to save up my premium currency for the, the super loot box that can possibly roll a 5 and 6. But I can't just get any 5 or 6. I need the ones that are tiered or that are close to my character, so I can then mill them to hopefully get what I need to upgrade that character. But again, everything else that I'm doing is not getting me any progress, because any 1 to 3 stars, it's just wasted time and effort. Because maybe I can get that resource to a level 5, or a 5 star, but that can take me months of grinding. Or I spend $29.99 and get the resources I need right then and there. And again, the games never start out as a grind in that regard. It just gets to that point over time. And again, you're not seeing that meaningful progression. Upgrading a guy from a 5 to a 6 star doesn't do anything for him. It's not giving me anything new. It's just saying, oh, instead of 1,000 points of damage, he now does 1,500 points of damage. And what's worse about games that are built on grind is that when you have that competitive aspect, it also means that you get to sit in the bleachers while people with higher quality stuff are just going to beat everything, and there's not much you can do about it. When we looked at South Park Phone Destroyer, for instance, that was a really big case in point. It doesn't matter, or the new Command & Conquer game, or shall I say, the new Command & Conquer game in quotes there, where it doesn't matter how great I am at strategy if the enemy just has everything 3 levels above me. And the point is that the game matchmakes you like that, so that encourages you to spend money or keep playing to grind out that experience. And let me check our time here for a second. We've been talking for about, I guess, like maybe 25 minutes on this topic. But we'll move on to some of our weird games in a second here. But we haven't talked about grinding when it comes to action-based games. And that's a very key difference. In action-based titles, you don't really feel the grind as much because it's the player themselves, Money and Conquer, thank you. It's the player themselves that is growing. So there's not much you can really do in terms of grinding. It's just about growing as a player, memorizing patterns, or getting the timing down. This is why for a lot of people, they don't really feel like they're grinding in a game like Bloodborne, Dark Souls, and so on. Because even though they are leveling up their soul level and so on, it's still about them growing. And as we've said before, it doesn't matter what level you're at in Dark Souls, if you can't figure out how to get your timings down, you are never going to beat that game. And it's why it's looked at very favorably, even though it has abstraction that determines stats and damage. Because if you've watched expert players, and especially speedrunners, go through a game like Bloodborne or Dark Souls, that when I get to that level, I can beat many bosses without grinding all that much. And there are entire speedrun optimization paths of knowing just exactly how much experience I need, what soul level I need to get to, and then it's just understanding how to exploit those bosses. For instance, I watched the Bloodborne, I think it was HDQ run of it, and the person beat a boss, I think it was, what was that boss's name? The Bloodstarved Beasts, I think? Or, no, it was that creature that was in that church, that one that always gets me with the poison. And I watched him play, and he knew exactly how many hits to do on the enemy to stagger him. And then he would repeat this pattern, and in doing so, he would take a boss that was very erratic and hard to beat, and he beat him in about 30 seconds. And he barely leveled himself up over the time. But in games like this, the progression curve is used as an alternative if your skill hits that ceiling. Because again, without having any progression like that, if you can't rise up to the challenge, the game is done for you. And this is what a lot of people didn't like about Cuphead and Fury in that regard, where once you hit your limit, there's nothing more you can do. Excuse me. Like for me with Fury, I couldn't get past it on the highest difficulty. Maybe over time I could play that. But once you hit that wall, it can become very demotivating to keep playing. But to wrap up this section, and I guess this recording part for people watching this on YouTube, a game, as long as the player feels like there is progress, then there doesn't really feel like a grind. And this is why a lot of people will say that grinding is good. But it's not the act of grinding that is keeping them motivated. It's the carrot on the stick. And as long as it's there, they will keep playing for hours and hours on end. But keeping the player invested like that requires a very engaging progression and gameplay loop, and understanding just how much to give the player. Get that length of the stick just right. If it's too short, like in Diablo 3's case, they're going to blow right through the progression model, and then what's left? Nothing really of matter. If it's too long, then the player doesn't feel like there's progress. For instance, if we use my hands again, let's say this is the game from start to end. You don't want the player to just see the start and end conditions. You want to have various mini goals. So, kill 20 enemies, get a new piece of gear, kill 50 enemies, complete the quests. And we talked, when I had a podcast with Jamie Madigan of Psychology of Games, we talked about this and how much short-term progression will hide or remove grind. It's better to have 10 quests that involve killing 10 enemies at a time versus one quest that requires you to kill 100 enemies. Because when you have those short-term goals, you see the light at the end of the tunnel. I kill one enemy, now there's only 9 left. Now there's only 8 left, 5 left, 2 left, the quest is done. I get my little dopamine push. Now there's another quest, I have to kill another 10 enemies. And one other hint, or one other tip for developers watching this, try to have goals that can be worked at multiple at the same time. Meaning, I kill an enemy and I may get the quest goal for killing the enemies, but I may also get the quest I need for Jimmy has 1 million, exactly. But I also maybe get the crafting materials I need to do for another quest. And as we were talking about earlier with Graveyard Keeper, it's that, take from Peter to pay Paul kind of model. That, yes, I'm doing the same thing, but as I'm doing it, it's working towards this goal, and this goal. Yep. And again, if you can disguise the grind like that, and I know when I say disguise, it looks like it sounds like very exploitive, but if you can put a wrapper around that grind, it does so much to keep the player invested. I'm trying to remember, and this is a question for the people watching this live recorder right now. I'm trying to remember a game that we played where one of the big changes to the progression was instead of just having the player grind enemies, they actually created a new story campaign that basically took the place of the grind. So instead of you just fighting enemies for like 5 to 10 levels, they give you a quest chain that gets you to that endpoint. So it basically hides the fact that you're just having to grind to get to the original point by having another story. What's that game that I played that did that? I want to say DC Universe Online, but I don't think it was that. But DC Universe Online was another big point. And I know I'm starting to ramble on about grinding here, but this is the last one, then we'll get to our weird game segment. But in DC Universe Online, there's a big difference between levels 1 through 20 or 1 through 30. I forget what the level cap was. But once you hit the level cap, the game becomes focused about going on these raid quests with your fellow players. But the only way to do that was to hit the right gear rating. And not just any gear rating. You needed raid-specific gear that actually had a rating attached to them. So your gear that you got at level 20 basically becomes worthless. It doesn't help you on the raids. So originally, you had to basically grind out epic level quests in order to gain the raid currency that you then needed to take into the vendor, and you had to get each part one at a time. So you had to grind to get your raid helmet, then your raid gauntlets, then your raid chest plate, and repeat and repeat. And then once all that's done, then you can go on a raid. But then, in order to go on the higher level raids, you need to get more gear, or more raid level gear. It's also madness inducing too, Foreign. And also voice killing as well. But what happened was the progression slowed down so much that there was just no real point in playing. So what they did as they revamped the game was to, as you got closer to level 20, when you hit level 20, they gave you one more series of quests that each quest ended with a raid piece of gear. So you're still grinding to get to that raid, but it's hidden by the fact that you have a quest to do. And once again, it's a short-term goal. So instead of going from here to here, we have these little chunks that will take you, basically all roads lead to Rome in a matter of speaking. So if I want to grind out the raid currency, I can do that. But I just do these quests, and yes, I'm still grinding the quest out. And eventually, or when I do that, it's over. And then once I'm ready, we then go on the raids. And again, as long as the player, and this will be our last point, and this will wrap up this segment, because this is the point to keep track of. Am I stuttering a little bit? It's hard to tell. I don't know. Oh, wait. 1 second. I was getting some frame loss there. Okay. Oh man, it's getting too hot here. I think that's what's also affecting my computer. But to wrap things up, as long as the player is making any kind of noticeable progression, they will keep being motivated to play. The second they lose that is when it's over.